So yeah, man, we'll go to
So
this
next
next.
topic, yeah.
Yeah, man. So obviously the other day, the big bombshell news was former Miami Dolphins head coach Brian Flores suing the NFL, talking about the hiring process having discrimination and racial undertones and being in that discrimination process. And he also had brought up allegations against Stephen Ross, where he alleged that the Dolphins owner, Stephen Ross, was offering him $100,000 to tank games, to intentionally lose games at the NFL level and stuff like that. Since then, we have had some responses.
Yeah.
Now, these responses, they vary a little bit, but they are very interesting as well. So the first person that that we'll address is Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, because he obviously has the Rooney Rule, and that is what is not being sued, but it is at the forefront of the lawsuit because of its design. And the design of the Rooney Rule is to enhance and improve the hiring process for minorities at the head coach and executive levels and stuff like that. So he addressed that part of it. If you got those quotes, Deke, go ahead and take over,
Yeah.
please.
I'm not going to comment on the specific allegations in the lawsuit brought by Brian Flores, but I do want to comment on the general state of affairs in regards to diversity policies and the NFL. Over the past several years, our diversity committee has recommended and ownership has adopted a number of enhancements to the Rooney Rule, as well as new policies designed to ensure that women and minorities are receiving full and fair consideration for coaching and front office positions. The details of these enhancements and new policies have previously been made available. While I acknowledge that we have not seen progress in the ranks of head coaches, we have seen marked improvement in the hiring of women and minorities in other key leadership roles, such as coordinator positions, general manager positions, and front office positions. Both in and out of football operations, I believe progress has been made as a result of the implementation of many of the enhanced policies that were recently adopted. The commissioner and league executives, as well as the diversity committee, remain committed to working with all clubs, the Fritz Pollard Alliance, and others in making these efforts as effective as possible and building upon them to promote the desired impacts on hiring decisions in the league at all levels, including head coaching positions. That is it.
Yeah, man. So first off, I do like the fact that he was just, blatant with it. He said, I'm not even going to address that Stephen Ross situation. I'm staying away from that altogether. I said, okay, Mr. Rooney, you're not playing around today. All right, I like it when the boss man come out there and speak. Now, when the boss man come talk, everybody come and listen. Yeah, he was like, look, we're not even going to play with that. If that's what Stephen was doing, that's what Stephen was doing. I ain't got nothing on anything over there, okay? But this Rooney Rule, we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, because then if he shits on Ross, he's shitting on one of the other owners, which makes it look bad on the league as a whole.
He couldn't touch it, bro. It was a lose-lose for him. Like, yo, you can't say anything. Just leave it alone, Mr. Rooney. Leave it alone. So I did like that part. But in all seriousness, I get part of what he was saying in the sense of, yes, we have seen an increase in minority or women hires in non-head coaching roles, talking potential GMs, some of the football operations stuff. But to me, I just look at it like this. If the representation, even in those veins, were at 1% and now they're at 5%, that's not enough of an increase. That's not enough of it when you look at every hiring cycle for GMs. How many of them are non-minority candidates? When you talk about some of these higher up executive positions, they don't usually get talked about as much because they're not the glamour of head coach, GM, or player position coach and stuff like that. So it's not talked about as often. But even in that vein, it's like, man, there isn't a large abundance of minority representation at that level. So it still is a fundamental flaw there. But the part that I didn't like was how he kind of just, he was like, hey, we know the head coaching situation isn't good, but what about these things over here? And it's like, well, those things are cool, but this part right here still matters in terms of the head coaching element, because that's still an executive position. That's still a leadership role. And the fact that there isn't representation there out of 32 teams, when you're talking about, less than 5 or less than 20% of the league and stuff like that, in terms of like the representation at the coaching level, like that has to be improved. Now, it got even more I started thinking about it even more a little bit, man, when you start to hear some more of these stories about guys bringing up these sham interviews where they're saying essentially they're just going to fill a quota. They're going to just check a box, man. Like, what was your thoughts on that feeling right there, man, in terms of like that whole narrative that's popping up now?
Well, yeah, there's definitely a flaw in the
Yeah.
Rooney Rule. I wonder with his comment, he's thinking now. How was it a couple years back? Wasn't there more minority head coaches a
That,
couple years back? Wasn't it up to
so
8 at some point
it,
recently?
it, it was that I forgot that was probably 5, maybe 6 years ago. I think
Okay, so the amendments
it
actually came after that.
yeah, because it was only for like that one season where it had ballooned like that, and then it went right back to being like I think whenever Marvin Lewis got fired,
Okay.
it was around like that time frame where they were like, all right, we got to make an amendment because it was literally like Coach T and Ron Rivera were the only two minority head coaches in the league. It was nuts. But there was a time where, yeah, it did get to about 6 or 7 guys. I think it was when Caldwell was in Indianapolis as well and stuff like that, man. But the problem has continued to be that it's not sustained. You know, when we talk about the non-minority element of it, those coaches, it's just how do you sustain every single season them having 25 to 27, you know, non-minority coaches every single season? Whereas like you do the math on the hiring cycle and the firing cycle, you do the math on just the sheer amount of players that play in this league that turn into coaches. If over 70% of the league is minority, and you think about that pool of players to go back into coaching, well, why is there becoming less and less representation at these higher end positions in football? That's going back to the Rooney Rule in terms of where that flaw is and how to address it and stuff like that.
Yeah, because I'm just wondering if he's
Yeah.
thinking with his statement, after the
Mm-hmm.
amendments, we have seen improvements in the
Yeah.
executive level with minorities and
Right.
coordinators and whatnot. Just let it play out. Like the
Yeah.
change takes time type of theory. But at
Yeah.
the same time, I do think there is like a fundamental
Yeah.
flaw in the rule because
Now,
of the sham interviews that you talk about. Because that's just BS, man. Like if
yeah,
you're not going to hire someone, they shouldn't
you're
have to
wasting
come in
everybody's
for an
time, man.
interview. It's just
Yeah.
fake, right? But
Yeah.
you still want minorities to get the
In the door.
opportunities
Yeah.
that traditionally white guys in those positions have
Yeah.
gotten. So how do you
Yeah.
do that? That's what I mean. The
Mm-hmm.
idea of the Rooney Rule has always been good. It's always been really good because you're
Yeah.
trying to get more opportunities for minorities, but we don't want the sham interviews.
Yeah. And another thing that I thought of with this, I was looking at how they incentivized it a year ago, right? This was last October when they fully made the amendment. But I think that it's reverse engineered in the sense they are rewarding the development of coaches to go to executive levels, but they're not rewarding the person actually taking the chance
The
on
draft
hiring
pick
these
stuff.
guys,
The
right? So
draft
it's
pick stuff
like,
you're talking about, right?
yeah. So the way it's set up right now, because the Kansas City Chiefs, they're about to receive an extra 3rd-round draft pick because they developed a person in their organization that got hired to an executive role to go to Denver with the Broncos, right? So the way the rule is set up right now, if you develop a guy, whether it's a position coach, whether it's somebody in the executive role in your organization, and they leave to go to become a head coach, they go to become a general manager or a front office exec, your team that exec is leaving from, they will receive a 3rd-round draft pick. So it incentivizes developing minority candidates, but it's not incentivizing the hiring of them. So for me, reason why I say it's reversed, I'm like, man, don't just incentivize the development. Why don't you incentivize the teams that actually hire these guys as well? Because now if you're also saying, hey, if you hire a minority coach at the head coach level or at a GM or as an executive, and in terms of like the whole interview process when it becomes open and stuff like that, if you hire a guy like that, hey, well, we'll give you a draft pick as well. So whether you're giving them a draft pick or if you say you want to give them salary, an extended salary cap, you boost up that. I think some of those things could be enticing. And as long as obviously you have to fine tune it to make sure that nobody's trying to, perform a little janky service of, all right, I'm gonna hire the guy this year, get the draft pick, then fire him the next year. Like you have to have some parameters and stuff like that around it.
Make it a future pick, maybe.
Right. Whether it's like, hey, not this year's draft, but the following year's draft. And the reason why I said the salary cap thing is because it's like, hey, while he's in that position for, this year, the first 2 years, or if he's there for the first 3 years, we'll boost your salary cap by extra 10 mil. You know what I mean? Something like that, right? And then it's like, hey, if you fire him though during that time frame, you're going to lose money out that salary cap as well. So I think of that and I'm like, that could also incentivize, because the whole thought process, or this whole notion of, well, hey, just hire the best guy. Hey, man, just let the process be what it is. Who needs a rule? If everything was operating the way it should be, you wouldn't need to have you wouldn't need to have incentives. You wouldn't need to have these rules. But because the elongated history of this issue, being what it is, it's like, no, we have to have these type of rules. We have to talk about that. And I'm glad that a guy like Mr. Rooney is actually trying to implement it and be at the forefront of change in this conversation, but it still has a lot of work that needs to be done, man.
Yeah. Now, what'd you think of the other responses? I think you had all three. You had not Flores, Ross.
You had Stephen Ross and John Elway.
Giants.
Yeah.
And Elway. Yeah.
Well, for the Elway one, I thought it was funny. I was like, first off, your PR team did a great job of trying to word this the way that they did. But I was like, you never really deny, the allegations about you appearing to be drunk. It was like, oh, man, I was on a flight, the night before. I'm like, bro, I hear that, but people can recognize drunk versus jet lag. But, I wasn't in that room. These are all allegations either way. So I was like, all right, I get it. Until there is proof, you got to accept both of these guys at their word. At least that's how I operate. Same with the Giants situation. Definitely, I wasn't really believing it. I ain't really feeling it.
Their best comment, though, was when they talked about Belichick. They were like, He has nothing to do with this organization. So text messages on him thinking a person has the job, that doesn't reflect what we're actually doing. I thought that was their best one. But yeah, all of this stuff is one side says something, the other side has their case. You know what I mean? Back and forth.
Because even with that, from their executives, those guys responded the way that they did. We talked about Hugh Jackson, but also right here in Pittsburgh, Terrell Austin. Yes, our Terrell Austin.
I saw some headlines.
His agent, yes. So Terrell Austin's agent also said that Terrell has been on sham interviews as well.
That was with the Lions.
Yes, absolutely. He talked about with the Lions. I think it was it was the Lions, and it might have been one other spot. But yeah, he definitely said that, man, the team, they already knew that they were I forgot who they were hiring, but he said they already knew that Patricia. It was Matt Patricia. He was like, they already knew they were going to hire Matt Patricia. Everybody knew it. And it was just, hey, you got to come in here to basically check off this box of, hey, we interviewed another minority candidate. Yeah, absolutely. And I was surprised to see that. Now, granted, Terrell would have to have confirmed it with his agent that he could even release that information. But I was surprised because, like I said, this is a rule that is named after, Mr. Rooney, not Art Rooney, but in terms of Dan Rooney and stuff like that. So when I think of that, and I'm just like, man, for his agent to say that while he's still employed in Pittsburgh, man, like, okay, it just feels like it has a little bit more validity to it because guys are really putting their careers on the line in some cases.
Yeah, and you might have hit on this last podcast, but with Flores doing the lawsuit, maybe you'll see more and more guys like Terrell Austin. Then you have Hugh Jackson just coming out with their stories.
Yeah,
in a sense, you know what I mean?
Because it's interesting to hear in times because it's like, man, well, who were some of these guys who were getting interviewed? Because not everybody that gets interviewed makes a headline. It's not, oh, well, hey, this guy came in to talk. It just rolls under the radar and stuff like that. So it is kind of like, oh, man, well, this guy was considered, they took him over him. But what was the context during that time frame? And that's the other part that I think of. It's like, man, we look at it after the fact. I'm like, oh, yeah, Patricia, man, you sucked as a coach. But during that time frame, were people going to be viewing Matt Patricia like that? You know what I mean? And that's the part for me where I always have to try to go back in my mind to remember what were,
he was probably a hot candidate.
Right. And that's the thing because he was coming off the Patriots staff. I think they had just won a Super Bowl as well. He was the DC out there. So like, it's things like that where I'm like, I have to just think in that context, not in the sense of I've already seen Patricia in that role. We already know Patricia failed in that role. Why would they put him over X and X and X? So that's the other part where it gets a little tricky with this, but it still continues to show
the same can be said with Brian Dable.
Correct.
Right? He's been a hot candidate for 2 years right
now. Absolutely. Absolutely. And even eventually when Eric Bieniemy becomes a head coach somewhere, it's going to be the same conversation with him, man. But yeah, man, it's just one of those things, dude, that it just continues to show a little bit of a pattern, though. And I think that's the part with the history of it where you're just like, man, where there's smoke, there's fire. How many times are we going to keep hearing these type of stories while still seeing the lack of representation? It can't continue to be the same thing. And one of the things that Terrell Austin's agent said on his behalf was that you get these opportunities and they're great because typically minorities want to get these opportunities to interview for these positions. But the problem is this: when you're going on sham interviews, it's kind of like LeBron's finals record, right? It's great going to the finals until you go to a lot, but you're not winning as frequently as you need to be. And now they're saying to you, well, man, you've been on 7 interviews. No one's hired you. Why should I hire you? And now it's like, well, dude, it's not that I'm a bad candidate. It's not that I don't interview well. It's just that I've been going on sham interviews
90% of those.
Yeah, I don't have
fans,
a chance. Right. So it just looks bad. And I even think about that in an extent with Eric Bieniemy, not all the way there just yet. But if the longer this cycle continues to go for him, where he doesn't get a head coaching opportunity, you're going to hear the narrative of what? Man, it's Andy Reid. Oh, man, well, he just doesn't interview well. Oh, well, his schemes aren't as good as you think they are. He played with he had Patrick Mahomes. But then it's like you could point to a guy like a Nathaniel Hackett. You could point to a guy that, is in the same exact situation where he has a head coach that calls these calls, where he has an elite quarterback, but yet they still get that opportunity, and he's just one example. I mean, we can go down that list as well, but those are some of the things that it hurts them in a sense when you are going on these sham interviews, like you just said as well, man.
The Bieniemy thing's interesting to me because wasn't it the last two guys, or usually anyone under Reid? The ones I can think of most recently are Peterson and then Nagy, right?
Yeah, yep.
They just get
because McVay
jobs.
And McVay's the other guy. Anybody that's been under McVay, they get coaching jobs as well, man.
Yeah, that's why the Bieniemy thing's interesting to me. Where do you think this goes? We have the lawsuit from Flores.
Yeah.
We talked about how some of these dudes are coming out with their stories now. But then we have all the responses from the Giants, Ross, Rooney in this case, and Elway. Yeah. Where do you think this goes from here? Because when the lawsuit initially came down, what were our even thoughts then? I can't even remember. Was it like, it's just good that some action's being taken? Is that all this? Do you think that's all this is? The result of this?
No. So I think
action and just more awareness.
So I think action, awareness, definitely. And I think end goal is going to be amendments to hiring processes. I think that's where this thing ends. But I just don't know how long that takes, because when you start talking about litigation, defenses and stuff like that, it just, it can get dragged out for a while before we really see any significant change. I don't think this is a this year change type thing, unless Flores had a smoking gun and the NFL just wanted to keep him hush hush. And they say, what do you want us to change? We'll change it. We'll do this and that. And it'll get fixed right away. But unless he has that smoking gun, they're going to play the litigation game, and we're not going to see anything of substantial change for a couple of years. Realistically, that's just how it goes. So for me, I think that the awareness is key, because it's going to keep getting talked about. I think that continues to keep putting
Flores
pressure.
Could just lose this, right?
Correct. He could. Yeah. But I think the biggest thing is continue to keep putting pressure on ownership, on executives, by having these conversations, by the media, the national media, picking up stories like this, continuing it, not just NFL outlets, but when you talk about your CNNs, your Fox News, your stuff like that, I think that part also keeps that narrative going, very similar to when we saw the social justice movement, right? Initially, it was kind of like, well, what's the end game? Initially, it was like, well, I mean, a couple teams are doing it, a couple players, but it's not really talked about. Now you fast forward to where we are in 2022, and it's like, man, they got it in the end zone. It's on jerseys. It's on helmets. Like it's commercial. It's a part of the NFL now. So I think that this could take a similar approach, where right now we're looking at it as, okay, this is the groundwork of it. But a year from now, it's like, okay, now we've seen an uptick in this area. Okay, more women are out here. Okay, now in another year, we see more people of Hawaiian and Asian descent getting involved as well. Okay, then from there, now, okay, we got a minority owner group. And that's how I see this thing going. But I think that this is definitely the framework for it. But he just has to, and not just Flores, everybody that has a story that they can help out in this avenue and are willing to, they just have to keep building up on this thing and keep taking it a step further. And then eventually, we'll see a more diverse representation at some of these higher up levels.